So I'm Matthew Pearson, and the other thing I forgot to mention is I may lose my voice entirely at some point, so we'll see. So Eileen may have to pull up the slide. I'm from the University Center for Writing-Based Learning, and I also teach in writing, rhetoric, and discourse, and I teach like a couple higher level classes each year, and sometimes teach first year composition. But grading writing to me, one of the things that, building off what Brenna said about the distinction between this workshop and the earlier one on feedback and commenting, grading writing to me, one of the things that stands out for me is that I feel like my teaching is in a lot of ways done when I grade. So I am scoring students on how well they have achieved certain criteria. Sometimes it's, and most of it has to do with aspects of their writing and learning that I want them to show me that they can do. Some of it is, though, like Sarah, you were saying, effort. I mean, there are times in which I do have effort being in the entire grade, like, you know, more informal, short writing, like, you did it or you didn't do it, you know, and that's, I think, helpful, and also having ones where there's a clear standard from A to F, and people get feedback on how they did there. But as we said in the earlier workshop, and the reason why I wanted to make sure we had this workshop as well, the workshop on commenting on student writing was explicitly about explicitly making the argument, and based on the research, as Jenny was kind of hinting at, that there's very little evidence of transference from one paper to the next. So writing a bunch of comments on paper A, expecting students to do better on paper B, unfortunately, there's not a lot of evidence that they can do that. Like, if you're gonna write a ton of comments on student writing, you should give them a chance to change that piece of writing. It's true of us. I mean, the comments we get on journal articles are for the same journal article. It's not like, next time you write a journal article, do this. It's change this journal article in these ways, and we'll take a look at it again. Anyway.
Is that because they don't read them, or because they can't incorporate them?
Yes, yes.
All of the above.
Anyway, I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself before you end.
Yeah, I'm the Associate Director of First Year Writing, so of course I teach our first year writing classes. I also teach, and have for a long time, in the honors program pretty regularly. I do teach some upper level courses in the Word department as well, but my life has been about first year writers, so I hear all of you who are in first year programs. I've also done a good bit of work earlier in my career in adult education. I want the whole class to be a positive experience for students, but grading is the point where the pedal, hits the metal, and you can't give everyone an A, right? Most of the time. I mean, theoretically, it could happen, but most of the time, that's not the deal. So I try to actually separate grading from issues like effort, because what I want students to take away is this is not grading them personally, how good a person they are, or even where I think they'll end up in the future, because sometimes people have weak moments, but you just know they're going to be okay. It's just going to take more time. So what I hope for in the grading process is to be able to give them some kind of realistic, honest evaluation, so they don't go into the world thinking they're perfect when they're going to take some hits and there are things they could do, but also that it's performance-based. That I'm talking about things that are on the paper, not whether I thought that they were rolling their eyes in the back of the room, or any of those kinds of things, or whether I think they're fun people or whatever. Just the paper, a way of communicating how this particular project went and how it's evaluated. And to let them know that it's fair, that the same criteria are applying to everybody, and that it's based on the assignment again. And so it's tying the evaluation to what was expected of them and what actually got taught in the class, and finding a way that doesn't keep you up all night for a week to do that. And I think what we're going to suggest today has that potential. Not perfect, not probably appropriate for every possible situation, but we think that rubrics are worth looking at. And we're very interested to hear how you react to what we're going to present.
So just wanted to briefly show you the example for today. And based on what you all said you wanted to learn or the questions you had, We assumed we were going to do this, but we're for sure going to actually delete this section this section on hands-on practice, because it's a little too abstracted out from your particular context. At least 3 or 4 of you mentioned, something I thought was really interesting, which is, and I experienced the same thing, the really good ones and the really bad ones are the easy ones. It's the ones in the middle. How do you articulate why and how, and also just assess the distinctions between the two? Because I agree. And I've even had experiences when I use a rubric, and we'll show you some examples here in a second, where I ended up scoring essays higher that I didn't think on that first read were amazing because they did everything I asked. And some kids just have a little way with words, but they didn't totally do the assignment. And without a rubric, I wouldn't have seen that. I would have just thought, wow, this kid's just elegant. It's fun, it's funny. Like this is good writing. I can see this in the oh, this other one's kind of boring, but hey, they did everything. And that made me question whether or not I wanted to change my rubric and allow for more space for that, like not being too rigid, as you mentioned, Roberta. So anyway, so we're going to skip that and go straight on to hands-on practice developing a rubric. Eileen's made a really awesome blank grid that you can use, or feel free to fire up a laptop and work on a Word table or whatever. We'll have some discussion and Q&A. Jenny, back to one of your points, we're going to jump right into showing some examples and not spend as much time on citing scholars, because we felt like we knew, like last time that we did this workshop on commenting on student writing, that we were fighting a kind of uphill battle. We thought most people coming to that workshop were assuming we were going to talk about grading, and we were making a pretty radical argument that if you're going to comment a lot on student writing, you should allow students to revise. So we felt like we had to show you all the evidence. We'll be happy to point you some resources that have some kind of good scholarship on rubrics. We're going to just jump over a lot of that stuff and go right into showing some examples, talking them through, and then developing your own rubric for a particular assignment you're thinking of, and some of you already mentioned, or a particular course, that kind of stuff. So we're passing around right now 4 different models. I will tell you a little bit about. And as we go, feel free to ask questions, but we will leave some time at the very end for
Yeah, we're not presenting these as ideal rubrics or just exactly what you should do, but examples of real rubrics in different disciplines that people are currently using, and to talk about just what are the features of a rubric and kind of some ways that you can customize them. So, has everybody got one now?
Yep.
Okay, good. So the first one, research paper rubric, comes from Adelphi University from a contemporary health issues course. And then the one that MCS 358, writing grading rubric Dobler, that's from Gustavus Adolphus University, and that comes from a class in making mathematical models. And the reflection writing rubric is from Carnegie Mellon's wonderful Everly Center for Teaching Excellence. I included that because so many of us are including reflections in our courses, particularly in the first year courses with portfolios and things like that. So I thought that was a useful one. And the final one is from Winona State's nursing program. They, as part of their program, have to do article reviews, and this was the rubric that was created for the nurses at Winona State, which has, I think, a very well thought of nursing program. So they're from different disciplines, they're being used for different purposes, and what are you noticing that they all have in common?
Exemplary with middle.
Yeah. Across the top, you have a range of possibles, which it directly addresses what a lot of you were concerned about. The first one, going from expert to novice, is interesting. I have seen these used in assessment, where they start out with mastery on the left hand and go to developing at the end. Then you can see, you can see that beginning, developing accomplished exemplary on the mathematical models one. The reflection writing rubric, I like to just spit it out that we are giving letter grades here, so I appreciate that they have sophisticated, very competent, but they also have the letter grades in the column, because sooner or later, you have to accept that. And then the one from Winona State has a percentage system there, with a numerical score. And then on the right-hand side, you're seeing all of the issues that are being evaluated, which is something that you have a lot of control over. Some of you mentioned you want to include writing issues, but you don't want them to overwhelm the content issues. And here you actually have a chance to lay out whatever on that assignment you're looking at that's going to be part of the judgment you make. Some people include a point system on that left-hand side where they'll say spelling and grammar 15 points out of 100 or whatever. So you don't have to make them equal categories if you don't want to, but you could. You could say these are the 6 or 7 areas, they're all important. And then as you circle or mark them, you can kind of see, like, so which column do most of the evaluations fall into? If it's preponderance of expert, okay. If it's mixed, so maybe then you're getting into the B+ kind of area. But it's very graphic. You can kind of see at a glance, first of all, what's being evaluated, and then students know that everyone's going to be working from the same template. My first suggestion is that a best practice that's important is that students see this before they get the grade. Ideally, this is created from the assignment and comes out well before the assignment is due, so they know going in that if they don't have at least 5 current sources, there's going to be trouble in River City, you know, and it's not you sniping at them or being unreasonable. It was out there. Anything you'd like to call attention to?
A couple of things, but one of the things that you said you did in a context where this quarter, where you didn't give the rubric out with the assignment is, Eileen worked on a rubric in class with the students to develop it. And that goes a long way towards like transparency, having an ethos of transparency, but then also like, that's a conversation for however long it took about the assignment and what they're supposed to do.
I'm real surprised looking at these that there's something I think missing in just about all of them, and that is the level of vocabulary and word use.
Yeah.
Because to me, a huge difference between the bad paper and the good paper is that the student writing the bad paper does not have a college level vocabulary, or sometimes doesn't have a course specific vocabulary. I mean, that's a really major problem. But the other one is sort of more general problem. But they're still writing kind of like middle school students in their word usage.
One of the things that
and I don't see that on here. I mean, their spelling and grammar are okay, but they're not writing at a college level for the other reasons.
Well, one of the things, just from sharing out already, Roberta, I mean, you more than anyone, I think, mentioned specific aspects of writing that you find particularly important. So I would just say that now you have at least 3 things that you want to include in your rubrics. Like, you know what I'm saying? And that's what's cool about these in general, is that you can really tweak them to the writing assignment. One thing to note is that the article review has almost no assessment of writing in it at all. But that instructor decided they're not going to worry about it for this particular grading criteria. And one of the things that I guess I just want to point out, one of the things we mentioned in the last workshop is there's a distinction in the rubric world between what people call holistic and analytic rubrics. What we've showed you are examples of analytic rubrics because we think that they're the best, and the research supports that they're a lot more effective in terms of being easy to use and also to give more fine-grained feedback. Holistic rubrics would do a lot of the same stuff, but they would say an A paper does this, and it would kind of combine all the elements. It would basically describe like everything under expert, but it doesn't give you a lot of flexibility if a student is incredible at one thing and terrible at another. So then you have to, I've found the only times I've used them, or I've been in contexts where I was asked to use them, it didn't feel that much different than the old school way that many of you were describing, which is like you can feel what's good and then it's hard afterwards. Because it almost feels like the first time you put something like a B or a C, you're fudging something because they're usually done some aspect of the assignment they've done really well. Some aspects they haven't, and then of course some students do it all well. So we didn't even really give examples of holistic rubrics because we just think that analytic rubrics are much more effective.
if you look at the Carnegie Mellon one, the third one, under their clarity and presentation, they do cover what you might call diction issues, sentence structure issues, quotation issues, and they're spelled out so that you can see what a really good paper accomplishes, as opposed to what an okay paper accomplishes, or an unacceptable one. The key is that the things that you value go into the rubric. Here they want complete sentences, they want well-framed quotes, they want explication of quotes, they want correct attribution. So that's what they put in. But if what you value is a professional diction,
Well, in the first year course, they're not gonna have professional diction, but
want
yeah, I mean, in a way, it's sort of, it gets into a whole cultural capital question, which is some students come into the first year
Yes.
program from high schools where they've expanded their vocabulary and learned to write very well, and other students come in writing like fifth graders, and what are you gonna, I mean, I think that goes back to the other workshop, right?
Yeah.
How do you give them feedback on expanding that? So,
But one of the things that I think the rubrics can help with is that issue, because you don't want to just be validating people who have already gone through the system and gotten a lot of help and a lot of, and sort of keep marginalizing people who are struggling in some way when they're actually smart and doing a lot of things right. The rubric allows you to recognize what's going well, even as you're honest about what's not, but it's a wider range of, because like I've been at workshops where people say, I'm very much in favor of good writing, so when I get to the 5th grammatical error, I just stop reading the paper. And, well, okay, but what about your brilliant student who has been in the United States for 4 months, who's doing, like even in a writing class, they're understanding the rhetoric, they're working on framing appeals, they're doing good research, but articles are a whole new thing to them, and that's kind of messing up the reading experience, but a lot is going right in the paper, and I think the rubric allows you to say, okay, I'm not flunking you, and here's why. You've done all of these things, so even if you still got shaky grasp of something, or you're very new to academic discourse because you haven't done a lot of this before, you still have some grounds for saying, I'm going to recognize that you're learning a lot of what I'm teaching you, but I'm going to flag that there are some issues that really need attention. And you can decide, how you weight that.
yeah, that was my next question. I didn't mean to monopolize, but these can be weighted, right?
Yes,
Because there's some that are
absolutely.
kind of sine qua non. If you haven't got this, the
Absolutely.
paper is awful.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
The global issues.
Yeah.
But then there are others where, well, you might lose some points on this.
Right.
Right.
So we'll play around with that when we develop our own, because when we did this workshop on Tuesday in the Loop, I think I took the opportunity to work along with people, and I was surprised by some of the weighting I gave. And to just reiterate what Eileen said, without an explicit weighting of the categories, the assumption is that they're all equal. So if there's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, they're all whatever.
They're all important.
4, 15, 16% or something, I'm in the humanities. But I could use a calculator. Anyway, but weighting them is sometimes really helpful. And I do want to definitely piggyback and just validate what Eileen just said. I think that, if you create an assignment that you feel has a lot of integrity in terms of matching the learning goals for your course, and then you write a rubric that kind of breaks those things down, a rubric does allow to really separate out feedback in a much more fine-grained way, and to validate students who do a lot of the things that you ask them to do, but they have certain things that hold them back. And if you feel like at the end of the day, being able to articulate thoughts, even after you've gone to the library and gotten those sources, and you've done all these aspects of the assignment, if the language piece is really important to you, you weight that really heavily. That's the kind of thing that you have got the ability to do, which I think is just a helpful thing. And then, or you could, the rubric could also hold a mirror up to your own practices and say, wow, you could see more clearly how hard the student's working to do a lot of the aspects, and then how easily you might have dismissed it before. So I think both experiences might happen because of using rubrics. Any like questions or other observations about any of these things? I mean, Bernadette, you mentioned already creating them. I'm sure other people have. I was curious if you thought these were similar to what you had done, or.
Right, the one I particularly used back, I just pulled it up because I was trying to remember all the categories. And it was for a critique of a research article that I assigned. Because I've noticed a tendency on students, just because it's published, means it's good and valid.
Right.
So I intentionally picked a selection of ones that were good, or they had problems. And sometimes it was a methodology, and so my areas were, but I'm writing down, I didn't give them different weights. So,
yeah, it's okay. The rest
right,
of it's
but I did have them first of all look at the purpose statement of the research question. These are my categories: the literature review, the target population, methodology, results, discussion, were there recommendations for future research, their references, and then was there any bias in the article? Were they able to identify who funded it, for example? It was funded by private monies. And then the APA format. And in the APA format, I actually threw everything. And I'm taking notes now. I do like the idea of pulling out specifically for grammar, vocabulary, the presentation to add on to it. So that was for a research article.
Right.
Yeah.
One thing that I think might be helpful is to read across in a few places just to see how the gradations go. Because that, as I think we've all heard, it's so easy to pick out the top paper, the one that just shines, and to find the ones where, they didn't do any research at all or whatever. But what's the difference between the B and the C and the B plus and the A, and how do you explain that to students when it's very hard to explain to yourself sometimes? Which one is looking interesting to people that we could look at, some of the categories?
I think another aspect that I want to talk about after we do this is the student reception of this kind of information.
Sure.
How they interpret it, what it means to them.
If indeed they look at it.
Right.
Well,
Well, how about with the research paper rubric? Since I have a feeling we have all assigned a research paper at some point, look at sources, because that's a pretty, in some ways, kind of more straightforward thing. Dr. Whalen clearly has criteria that have been laid out in an assignment that involves having 5 current sources, and that they hit certain levels of academic quality. So you can kind of see what are the follow-through categories. One is peer-reviewed articles, or scholarly works, and the credibility of websites. So you kind of see that the paper that is the novice, which must be the D range, fewer than 5 current sources or fewer than 2 of 5 are peer-reviewed journal articles or scholarly books. Not all websites utilized are credible and or sources are not current. So that would be unacceptable. The terrific paper has the sources, 3 of them are peer-reviewed, and they have background sources and specialized sources. They're varied. They have special interest in popular literature acknowledged as such, and the websites are all authoritative. So
what's good too is that it continues in proficient the same standards for web resources. There's some things that carry over, that it's still held at the same high standards in proficient. It's just that there's now 2 peer reviewed. That's the distinction.
So how do you work across that? What diminishes or builds quality in the middle 2? Because those are the hard ones. If, anyone can write the 2 end pieces, I think, if you know what your assignment is.
Well, I just want to say, it also, the criteria over here vary and how easy they are to apply, because
Yes.
to see the grammar and spelling is correct or incorrect is easy.
Yeah.
To see that an argument
Yep.
is convincing,
Yep.
I think that rubric, and I have it in my work, in
Right.
my student assignments. I think that rubric is terribly hard to explain to the student. What was wrong with my thesis? What was wrong with my argument? Especially if you're asking them to do something somewhat original, not just to summarize somebody else's argument. I think
Yep.
it's pretty clear, but
Yep.
to come up with their own argument. I think it's very hard to explain why they didn't have a good one.
I think you already just did, for real. You got that criteria.
It's-
Original versus someone else's.
Oh.
I mean, that should be there. And I think the one you were pointing at, the reflection writing rubric, it's really specific, I mean, to the point where we can't even totally understand it. I mean, we can literally understand the semantics, but maybe some of our art folks here could talk about the implications of chosen ideas for the art in classical Greek, or you know what I mean? Like, so what's good about that is it's really specific to the class. And while I agree with you that one of the hugest challenges is explaining to students why an argument is good or bad, I think that it's possible, and that this is a really good example of it. And it's probably a place that a lot of us have spent a lot of time commenting on student writing. And you know, one of the cliche moves in writing center work, or you know, in teaching writing, is the idea that a thesis statement has to have a so what embedded. You know, like, why did I care about this? Anyway, so that can be a part of your argument, what a good argument is. And that, you know, another example of something that I was taught in the program I was in Wisconsin was that a thesis statement has to take an arguable position. You know, it can't just say that there's been some precipitation today. That's not an argument. We all agree. It's like, you know, the only disagreement there is going to come from someone who wants to deconstruct language, or who's not sane. You know what I mean? Like, reasonable people would agree that this is a arguable position. You know, like that's the criteria that our director put out there. So anyway, but I do think it's possible.
Well, I think it's the biggest difference between a reflection writing and a research paper. I think for students, not that I don't get questions, a million questions on the research paper as well, but I think it's easier to explain what is expected of them.
Yes.
Versus I want you to write a reflection, and you kind of see them freak out right away. You go, what do you mean? What's the rubric? And sometimes it depends on what type of reflection I'm asking of them. I can't give them a rubric.
Right.
If I tell them to go into a community and engage, and then come back and reflect on it, what am I going to say? I don't even know where you're going.
Right.
So I try to maybe give them bullet points, and then check, like literally to check off things that they need to bring in. I could describe the surroundings. Did you go alone or with someone else? But I think for students that's not having a rubric almost scares them, and so I struggle with that. I feel like I do give them rubrics though, but I criticize myself for doing that sometimes, because I feel like I'm still telling them what to do.
Right.
And isn't this the time for them to critically think about things, including figure things out?
Yep.
And so I think it's a balance between to give them enough to know what I'm expecting of them, so they don't freak out on me, but at the same time not to walk with them and almost tell them what to say. So that balance is, especially I think in the reflection more so than the
Absolutely.
research paper.
Two quick thoughts on that, and I don't know if you have anything. One thought is that rubrics are much more appropriate for when you have an ideal paper in mind. I would say the same thing about assignment design. You know, your more detailed assignments will come when you know what you want students to do. Sometimes assignment prompts that are pretty vague and broad can be totally appropriate if you truly are open to a bunch of different iterations of the assignment. But if you know what you want students to do, I think it's just ethical to tell them, you know, rather than make it like a game that they're going to figure out. But if you're open to a lot of different possibilities, then a broader assignment can be good. And I think so too with rubrics. The other thought I had more specifically is maybe for you and Roberta, one challenge maybe you want to take on in the practice time that we'll have later is how can you try to write some of those descriptions in the boxes for a given category where you do address the issue that you both shared, which is being too rigid or shutting down student options or creativity, or them doing some hard work for themselves. Because I do think that in the models there are some good examples of where things aren't too much prescribed, and then there are examples where they're really prescribed, and I think in an ethical way, like in the math one or the nursing one, it's pretty clear what they're supposed to do.
I'm just going to ask a question, because I think this is where I fell into traps. And then just looking at the first one where it said authoritative websites and one where credible. I think we need to define these for students, because what's credible to them is Googling something.
But that has to happen when the assignment is
Wikipedia.
given.
So I think, because they're using two different words here, credible and authoritative.
Yes.
So I think we have to define what
The
we're
assumption,
Absolutely
the assumption
you
is
do.
that they've done it in class.
Okay, okay.
That's why, as I'm sure you've noticed when you've been on assessment projects, looking at student work when you don't know what the teacher has been saying to them in class or what the textbook says, it's really a dark passage because we all develop our own sort of common vocabulary with our students and they know exactly what, well, we hope they do know what we mean. But for an outsider looking at a rubric like this, you're wondering, so did they ever tell them that? Well, hopefully, yes. One of the things I wanted to say about these more open-ended or creative assignments, you don't want to tell them exactly what to do, but you do want them to be specific, for instance, right? You do want to have concrete examples of things that they saw and thought about. Those kind of things go into the rubric, because usually when those kind of assignments don't work, it's because the students, they're having the experiences, but they're not getting them down on the paper so other people can share those experiences that, you know, even on reflections about writing, students will say, I spent a lot of time on revision and polishing up my grammar, but they don't say what, or on what assignment. They don't say, now if you look at paragraph 2 of my draft and my final, you'll see that, you know, I took that long 87-word sentence and I broke it up. And they need some coaching on how to do that, but I think that a rubric probably is fairly possible even in an open-ended or creative assignment, or like an opera scene. There are still things you would be hoping for that you could tell them about. So.
And then Sarah, back to your question about student perception of rubrics. I think I've read a little bit of research on it. I don't know if you've read much research on it, but I think that students definitely see in it, like there's a report positively that your grading criteria are more transparent and explicit, and there's also a lot of research we talked about in the other workshop. Students don't read a lot of comments. Transitioning from one to the next is from one paper to the next is hard. So something like this, where you got it back and it looked like this is actually pretty good, you know, like it's pretty legit. Like that is what you're telling a student, and then they have a grade attached to it. So I personally have never had a student use rubrics. You know, a lot of times in being a teacher for about 15 years, never had a student treat the grade as anything different than what if I didn't have a rubric. You know, they didn't seem to think it was more suspect, and more often than not, I got the perception that they thought it was, you know, like a good faith effort on my part. Like my student evaluations, one of the highest criteria I always get is just like my grading criteria are fair or whatever. You know, back to what Eileen was saying, because you give it to them early on. They can, if you do any kind of peer review, and I think you may in some of your classes or other people may. This can be a really great bad cop for the students to talk to each other about the paper. Like, Ron, I noticed you don't have this. Like, I'm not saying it's bad, but I'm trying to help you with it. You know what I mean? Like,
So what grade would that student get? I mean, it's they're in some categories, they're proficient in others.
Well, you have to see what the weighting is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you don't know what the weights are.
A minus B plus.
Well, the big problem we have in graduate school students is they all want to be A's. You know, they all figure that they're
Well,
A.
so do the
A+.
freshmen.
Yeah, B is like a bad grade.
Yeah.
Right.
Plus
Yeah.
isn't bad.
I think we can.
I have taught several first-year writing classes where I asked students to investigate their other writing assignments, so they brought in all the writing assignments and syllabuses for their other courses and wrote about like what their other teachers seem to value. They are convinced that nobody cares about the things they learn in writing classes and that their other teachers only care about spelling and punctuation. Those are the only writing issues, and some of them have debated things like whether other people care if they have titles or not. So their perception is that no one's paying attention to this except these people in Word and probably in English too, Jennifer, yeah. They're astounded that anything like this is floating around in our heads at all. I mean, it's such a revelation to them that we actually know what we're looking for and that we can share it with them. Many of them think it's completely subjective, and they will say things like, well, what one teacher wants, the other teacher doesn't want, and you know, then you can talk to them, well, yes, but of course people want different things, that's okay. So just the fact that you know what this means is kind of reassuring to them, that you thought about it in advance and that you're applying a standard across the board, even if some of, you know, maybe they can't fully articulate in the same way you could what any individual thing means. At least it gives them something to start with, as Matthew said. If they really think you're wrong, they can say, well, you said this and I thought I did this, what went wrong? But that's a whole lot better than, I don't understand anything about what went on with this paper. So, first of all, it's a statement of where you are, that you have analyzed the assignment, that you have standards that you're willing to share. And I think that that's reassuring for students to know that there's something kind of objective and fair at the base of grading, because they don't believe that going in. And I'm sure you possibly have read evaluations like, so she just favors the guys in the class, and then in the same batch, and it's so clear that she favors women and doesn't listen to, and all of this stuff that, this kind of fantasy, but I think it's the vacuum. They don't know. And so they make up stories that kind of cover the situation. This at least puts something out in front of them that you can talk about. And if you go over it in class before the assignment is due, there is a chance for them to say, well, hey, what's that? And it doesn't take that long. Writing rubrics takes a while, but once you've got one, usually it's a matter of adapting it, not starting from square one the next time you do it.
My experience too is that students, there may be a subset of students in the class that will do well on the assignment no matter what. There may be some students that just don't care, or if they have other intense things going on in their life that quarter, and it's going to be hard for them to succeed in the class. But there's going to be some students in the middle who do better because of it being broken down this way. And there'll also be some students who may not do that much better, but know it's their fault because you told them. I mean, and I'm not trying to be crass, but that is better for them to kind of know, like, okay, like at the end of the day, Professor Kimball worked really hard to write an assignment and worked really hard to grade a rubric, and I just didn't work that hard on it. So it's on me,
A couple of questions. One, when you create a rubric like this, and this probably reveals how much of a novice I am at this kind of thing. Is that how you actually give back an evaluation? You actually have a stack of these things and you read it and you go,
That's one way to do it. I think you could probably make it electronic and have it and choose and then have it just put out a row and tell them. But yes, that tends to be what people do.
And you can add a note to it, a holistic note at the end. I do. And you also can still mark on the paper, but you don't have to mark everything. When you have a rubric, I think just putting some examples of the things that the rubric refers to, so you don't have to mark over the whole paper. Those are, but some people do just use the rubric, and if you've got a gigantic class, this might be, more than students were expecting. Better than the good ideas, some problems with grammar, be kind of response.
You could probably make it electronic pretty easy.
The D2L has a rubric system embedded in D2L, so you can pull up an assignment that's been submitted via D2L and have the rubric pop up to check what you want, and it'll do that.
And it'll
put it in
feedback,
grade.
and will it show the student the
It'll show
categories, the
student
descriptions of what they
categories, and
got?
it'll go straight, you can link it to your grade book, so it'll also take the numerical results, as long as everything's weighted the same. It'll take the numerical result and put the letter grade that corresponds to the grade book.
And so they can see it too.
Yeah.
Great.
Other question I have about, I'm looking at this reflection rating rubric, and of course in first year program, they have us do a fair amount of reflection rating. And one of the things I have difficulty in defining for the students is the difference between a reflection that has some kind of analytic thinking versus a rant. I'm reflecting on this so I can do whatever I want, and I find I don't know how to. I've worked my butt off to try and define that verbally ahead of time, and I've used probably the equivalent of what's a holistic rubric. But I don't know. I always blame myself. It must be my fault. But I'm just wondering how can one define that difference really clearly and succinctly?
Right.
I think you can separate, I don't know if you've heard of Kolb's theory, but I teach experiential learning courses. So you want them to reflect on an experience in many different ways. You want them to analyze the situation, tell you the facts of the situation and so forth. You also want to have a category for their feelings about the situation. Did it change them or whatever? Then how are you going to use this information in the future? How does it connect to either something you've learned or something you're going to do. So even if it's totally experiential, you can break that apart and give them, different ratings for the various parts of the model. But if you, Kolb, K-O-L-B, you can just Google him, you'll see how he takes students through a full analysis of an experiential learning event that they went through. That might be helpful.
Okay. And also the relationship between like assignment design and the rubric, I think, may play a role here in that we're about to practice with it, so maybe you can play around with it, and we'd be happy to give some thoughts on it as well. But the rant maybe, I'm guessing, doesn't have as much grounding in course readings or course concepts. The rant maybe doesn't acknowledge that there could be another perspective out there besides the ranters. So, I mean, you know what I'm saying? There are probably ways that you could show that, and
That's how do they articulate that rant?
yeah.
I mean, they have feelings about this situation. How are they presenting those in a professional way or a college level way?
Or making the case. I mean, one of the things that's important, I think, in almost all our disciplines, in lots of different genres, is making the case explicitly that what you're talking about matters, and it matters in a particular context. And I think that's why, like, the disciplinary context is an obvious one. But even for the first year writing program classes, like, why should someone care about this topic? And the ranter may just jump right in, so angry or so sure of herself or himself that they just don't even make that move. So there probably are moves that would manifest themselves. And I agree that it is harder to diagnose and articulate the higher level things, but the act of creating a rubric is sometimes one of the most powerful. In some ways, it's a more powerful check on yourself and like the way in which your own learning goals and assignments match up than just creating the assignment itself. This is like, do I really believe in what I wrote in the assignment? Is there anything else that you want to talk about before we jump in? I mean, if anyone has any other questions about these rubrics, we have plenty of time left, but we did want to make sure we had a significant amount of time to actually practice. We have some blank grids. But if people have other questions about any of these particular rubrics, or that really concrete question of what do I do, like how do I give it back to students?
Did you want to show them this?
I don't think so. I could. Do you think I should?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
This is Matthew's, because it
I'm
has.
trying to be really efficient with time.
It has
but you can do
room
it.
for a rating and for comments, and I thought that this was kind of an interesting model to show how varied they can be.
Yeah, this one doesn't have any of the.
This isn't a grid like one
Right.
you're looking at, but it still works in a lot of the same ways.
You're trying to trip your head.
Yeah, you're good. So yeah, this is just something where I went ahead and thought, I'm not really gonna worry about, because part of it is that there's so many categories on the left-hand side that are in some ways a checklist of the assignment. I didn't feel the need to totally articulate the distinctions between them, although I probably would prefer that as a student.
Now, what course is this?
This is a class called Intermediate Composition that I taught at a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin. Students had read a research proposal. We were also using this book called Style, 10 Lessons in Clarity and Grace.
Where is
by,
it?
the book or the?
The book.
Yeah, it's called Style. I think at this point it may be called just Lessons in Clarity and Grace, because there might be 11 or 12 of them now. It's by Joseph Williams.
Do you recommend it?
I think it's nice. I mean, I think it's one of the best things of it that talks about like really concrete things that writers do. But it's pretty intense if you don't like teach it. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how much students could get out of it without really digging in. I only used a couple chapters on it.
Might give us some vocabulary.
I think
to
it's a
explain to
good
the
book.
Oh yeah.
It grew out of the Little Red Schoolhouse program at the University of Chicago, and they don't have composition courses in the conventional sense. They're attached to their humanities center there. Probably some of you went there and know this.
My husband teaches the
Yeah.
writing portion.
And they're dealing with very good students, but even very good students have to learn to write academic discourse. It's not an innate process. And what, Williams is dead now, but what he worked on were things like issues like cohesion and coherence. How do you move from paragraph to paragraph, and how do you tie the sentences in a paragraph together? You know, and he explains, you know, issues like passive voice and how it works and how it doesn't work and how you would make that choice. And so you have to be willing to think about writing in great detail, and I think it could be overwhelming for beginning students, but for intermediate students or grad students who have some writing under their belts, I think it's a book that I keep on my shelf and get out and look at, because it helps me with my own writing and to explain writing issues to other students.
It's called Style, Lessons in Clarity and Grace by Joseph Williams.
And Colombo is his.
I don't know if it's a single author one. Joseph Colombo is like definitely is cohorted as his main.
Well, he's
group,
at least
right?
alive, so
Yeah, right. But yeah, it's a good book. One of the things I like about Joseph Williams is that he is, I mean, anybody who knows about linguistics knows there's like a pretty huge battle between what they call the prescriptivists and descriptivists. And he's pretty informed by descriptivist linguistics, meaning like, let's look at how people actually use language rather than let's look at how people should use language. So he has one of his chapter in that book about correctness makes the argument that there is about 15% maximum of grammatical rules that are like actually essential. 85% of them are just historical flukes. That was like some influential person's bugaboo.
Like splitting infinitives.
Splitting infinitives, or like no preposition at the end of a sentence. It's like he takes it back to some Protestant minister in the 1800s, and he just basically says that like, but he also makes it, as John Bean, another person who's really influential in writing across the curriculum. If you have these bugaboos, tell students. You know what I mean? Like, because you're going to like.
If you're going to whack people for starting a sentence with and let them know.
Exactly.
Because they're scared. I mean, that if they come out of high school with anything, it seems to be a healthy sense of fear of all the kinds of mistakes that they can make, and I think that it constricts their writing tremendously. Well, there are the students who don't worry about anything, but most of them I find do. They're thinking about all the ways that things can go wrong. Some students told me about an experience where they were told to write about Yeats's Lake Isle of Innisfree, the poem, which, you know, one student was saying, and I love that poem. I mean, you're feeling all warm inside. Well, she got failed on the assignment because instead of writing one paragraph, she wrote two. And I feel like if you really want people to write a single paragraph, you should not play games with them. They should know that the second paragraph knocks you right out of the water. I think that this teacher's idea was teaching people to follow instructions exactly. But to do it like a landmine seems to me wrong, and I think that's one of the things rubrics can prevent. If you're really going to whack people for using contractions, and God knows why, but let's say you would, they should know that. If there are certain kinds of sources you don't want to see, they should know that, you know, and this takes care of that, and I think they appreciate that.
Yeah. So just one real quick comment on this rubric. This, even though it didn't have preset categories that I could circle, it still did make me grade more efficiently and quicker. And so, for example, if you look at like literature review, the second line, I spelled out how many sources they had to have. But I would just sort of, if I wanted to, I would say like, okay, and then I would say like, you only had 4, you know, in the comments, but it would be a really quick comment. And it was just a lot more efficient, because think about how you make that comment without a rubric. You'd have to count up to 4 in the entire paper, and then some, you know what I mean? Like, it was just right here. And this is an example, this is the rubric that, as I said at the beginning, because there were so many elements in the left-hand column, forced me to give some students higher grades than I may have otherwise, because they did all this stuff and did it pretty well. And some students who were much more elegant, fun to read writers didn't do some of these things. And so at that point, I feel like I had a choice as an instructor whether or not to revise the rubric, or whether or not to be okay with that and feel kind of guilty about what I graded like before the rubric.
Yeah.
And I chose the latter. I thought, like, at the end of the day, it's a research proposal. I wrote a really detailed assignment. Doing the things I told them to do was more important than, you know, coming to class with the skills of being an elegant writer. So.
Yes, what were you doing?
Yeah, I'm just curious how, I don't know if you remember, I don't know how long ago you this, but how long their research paper was?
It was a proposal, and so it was 8 pages.
And then was that something that during, are they on the semester?
Yeah, Wisconsin semesters.
So was that something that during the semester then they wrote the final?
No, it was one of 3 writing assignments, and even with a whole semester, I don't know if we could have done it like a real legit. I mean,
Okay.
certainly, you know, I've struggled with the very issue that I think you're hinting at is how do you do real good research papers on the quarter system.
Yeah.
The only ones I've seen that I feel like I would feel comfortable with, and I'm not judging what anyone else does,
Yeah.
are in the library like week 2 or 3. Like they
Right.
seem really good for higher level courses for undergrads where it's realistic for them to pick a topic week 2 or 3.
Right.
But, I mean, and a research paper is also like it's a fuzzy concept, but if it's gonna have that level of originality, like if it's gonna have the, you know, you're finding a gap in the actual research and claiming you're gonna help fill it, you know, not just like, I'm interested in this topic, let me go find some sources.
Right.
You know, and I'm not trying to say I'm the definitive,
No.
I can say definitively what the research paper is, but I meant that, when I said research paper, I meant you're really trying to say something new.
Right.
I didn't think they had time to do it, so I just said, you know, let's just propose what you do.
Okay.
We have 2 people who had their hands up.
Oh, I was just gonna say that what I like about this, that you broke down style language into multiple things, and I think that's a way of getting away around the
Yes,
reading.
yes,
To
yeah,
make
yeah,
it easier to do the numerical
exactly.
calculation. Is there something you want something to be weighted, you can just break it down and do it
Exactly.
in categories, so that it ends up being worth twice as, style language ends up being worth 3 times as much as the correct citation usage,
Yep.
because it's broken
Indeed.
down.
And also, like, one of the things that I kind of been implying, but that this helped me do is the rubric, and I've had the experience of it being a positive thing in some ways to not give the rubric right when you give the assignment, but to do it kind of in the middle if there's a 2-week gap, because it allows me to even more finely tune the categories to what I taught in class. I try really hard to grade my students on what I teach in class. And, you know, especially if you're teaching the same course over and over again, like some quarters you go really in depth into something, and in some other quarters it barely gets mentioned. So I feel like, you know, this allows me to, you know, kind of say like, okay, there's gonna be way more emphasis on like this example of what I think is also hinting at too. Williams talks a lot about concision and cohesion. One thing that we do, probably without even knowing it a lot, is there's a lot of old to new formation. Like the relative clause does that a lot. While this is the case, this is also true. You know what I mean? Like we're pointing back with a pronoun to what we said before, and we do that a lot when we write. You know, when we read really elegant stuff like in the New Yorker, there's a lot of establishing what's already been said and then moving on.
Another thing to say is I've noticed that it is harder in the current system obviously to write a good paper, and so over the years I've cut down on the number of pages.
Yeah.
And I would not strike it down completely. It's been suggested to me by many people saying, why do you do it yourself?
Yeah.
I just feel obligated because I feel like they need to learn to write.
Yeah.
It's actually been one of my criticisms. I took it as, you know, something good. When somebody said, you're writing like an English professor, not psychology, I want thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
But I do, and so I cut down on pages, and that's my thing, and I don't know what the standard is. I told them that concise is nice. I'd rather you give me quality rather than quantity. But I also make them choose a topic sometime in the first few weeks, and then they have assignments that kind of, it's a snowball effect.
Exactly.
So the first one is an article, so they need to choose 3 articles. Empirical, I'll explain what empirical is because apparently it's not as clear to students as we take for granted. And then they have to analyze one of the articles in the article review. So they already knocked down one of their articles, and they already wrote about it, so they can just literally, I tell them, copy and paste it and then paraphrase it. And then they have an annotated bibliography, which they include one of the article that they reviewed, plus 2 other sources. So I know they have to find 3 sources. And I'm not saying all students do that, and I know I did that. I waited until the last minute to do things. And so this kind of almost makes them do the work as they go along because we're on the quarter system. And then at the end of they have the paper, so I tell them, now you have all of this stuff in your bibliography because you wrote about it. And now you can work on your paper. So I think that maybe helps.
That's great. Sarah, did you do that in the class that we had writing fellows? Was all the writing leading up to a final project? Yeah. I think that's a great way to do a higher level class with a research paper at the end. Every piece of writing is for that. Early on, it's summaries of the stuff they're going to then it's an annotated bibliography, then maybe it's a draft of the literature review section, then maybe it's a final. That's a great way to do it. And it's not fake. I think some people worry, like, you know, about the reusing it. Like, no, that's actually.
Oh, I tell them, that's why.
That's manifesting our writing process, you know.
But I do have a
taking what
question,
we
you
have
just
and-
mentioned something,
Yeah.
and I don't know how everyone feels about it. So I have this rule where students are not allowed to use the same paper for more than one class. But I've heard some people say that, what's the big deal? And to me, that is a big deal,
Yeah.
because it's original work, but then it's
Right.
supposedly their original work.
Yeah.
And so I still see it as plagiarism, and I see it as you didn't do the work. Like, you know, you just, that way they can write with one paper through their college career.
Right.
But I don't know if I'm like the only bad guy who is, you know, because I've had students throughout my career turn in, and then I get it, you know, through the Turnitin, and it says 100%.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I want to speak to that because I think what I try to do is to have them tell me honestly that they might use some of the same topics,
Oh,
or some of the
that's-
same
yeah, that's
ideas,
okay
or even
with
some
it.
of the same sources,
Mhm.
but that they're gonna write it in a different way. And I think a way to get around that is the structure of the assignment, because I think on a lot of these rubrics, one of them is, does it speak to the assignment as it's worded? And I think you can often catch a paper that's been written for another course because it doesn't really match your assignment. So I think to sort of be open to the fact that it's a topic that interests them, but not let them just turn in the same paper. I agree 100% with that.
Well, on the topic, I actually tell them it's good if you do it, because then you are learning more about the topic. Maybe they want to dedicate their career to a specific depression, and so they're writing on depression, so I'm not going to punish them for that. But it's the exact same word that bothers me. Okay, so I'm not.
I agree, no, that should not.
I don't know what the policy is, but to me that,
Yeah,
my first reaction to that is that there's something quite different about doing the same paper for 2 courses in the same quarter. And like you maybe even becoming clean about it and telling both professors so it becomes more in depth than literally turning in the same paper you already wrote. That, I don't know if that's like plagiarism, it's just like laziness. You know what I mean? Like,
This came up in my department, somebody handed a paper to me that they had previously turned in for another course, so I went to my director, and she said that there is such a thing called self-plagiarism, and she did go to the academic board, and it was, you know, the actual hearing and everything, and the student it came to actual, yes, this is plagiarism, and she said that what she has done and recommends to her professors is to, if a student wants to write on the same topic for 2 different classes, put the professors together, have a meeting with the student, and then say like, how can we draft this to where they can work on one really great paper that would suit both of our needs.
But is this undergraduate or graduate level?
This is undergraduate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Happens a lot of crossover between focal points particularly and WRD 104, because in both cases there's an in-depth research effort on a topic. And one of the things that just helps, by the way, is the e-portfolios, because I always tell my students I'm going to look at their previous e-portfolios that they've posted, and you know, and when I see that, oh gosh, you know, Blair Bamward is doing his class on the Cubs again, which is very popular, and I've got a student urgently needing to write about Wrigley Field for 104, I say, oh, okay, well, I'll be looking at what you do with Dr. Bamward, and we'll see how things go. But I do think that the academic integrity ombuds people are wonderful resources for questions like this, because they really know the policy in depth and know practice in the university. And I think it's very worth looking at your college's ombuds person and just saying, how does DePaul treat this? What do I put in my syllabus as language that will head it off at the pass?
So what we were just discussing is like, say you had a student and you're like, wow, this is really excellent, and you could say that they've fulfilled all the excellent column. What grade does this like all circled excellent paper earn?
An A.
Right, it's an A, but
Yeah.
is it like a 98% or is it a 100%? Is the, you know?
You can give like a course, a point range within a column. Like your top-notch column could be like 100 to 93 points or 100 to 90. So, you know, so you can actually locate it that way.
Yeah. Right, because, you know, sometimes you get a paper and you're like, this is really excellent, and then 98%. And they're like, if this student asks me, where's the 2%?
Right. I think also too, like, I mean, I'm sure that there's some mathematical way to figure out what I'm about to say, but it strikes me in my own experience that depending on the number of assignments you have for your class, at the end, in some cases, it just won't matter. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
if there, I guess it would, am I right to say that the more assignments you have, the more it matters? I can't tell, but anyway.
Using even numbers helps, that's just what.
Right. Yeah, I use a point system for the course.
Yeah, right.
So there's like 1,600 points.
Yeah.
There's so many for this, there's so many for the discussion boards, there's so many for the quizzes, the self-mastery, and then I don't have to worry about if it's an A or a B or whatever.
Right.
It'll all add into the grading, it'll be spread out.
Well, I think helps you at the end is when they actually total up all the points, you've given them grades on all these different assignments per se, but then you're not actually making the final determination about their grade.
Right.
You know, it's like, this is what the total is, I mean, unless they're like half a point off or something like that, then you can make some.
But just keep in mind too, like, looking at the nursing rubric at the end here, this one, I was talking about this with Lynn, if it, to the degree it maps onto grades, it's incredibly harsh, because the second category is a C, and the third category is an F, and the fourth category is a serious F.
Right.
So if you're going to map it onto grades, you need to do it, like, you need to make it like, you know,
Unless they make 75 a B and 50 a C.
I guess.
And,
Right.
I mean, it's
It's
theoretically
all
possible, and I remember when we went to a seminar with Barbara Valvord, who is a very important person in the whole student, evaluations and so forth, and she said that she wanted to argue that there could be, and I think at the graduate level certainly could be, a course where you give everyone an A.
Yep.
It could happen. She was giving an example of an oncology nursing course. Do you want the B+ person working on your chemotherapy? Not probably. You want everyone to be at a superior level, and hopefully that can happen. And so it might be, that you won't ever get out of a B category in some courses, or you could have a class, and I've had them, where it's just not, the A's are not happening. You get people who are getting up to like a B+ level. It's kind of a tough quarter to get through for everybody, but sometimes that's how it is.
Well, if everybody gets A's, is it a challenging enough course? I mean, is it academically challenging?
Well, at a
In some
graduate
cases.
level, I
think at a
certainly think
graduate
it
level,
could
but
be,
you've really
the amount of
already
work that they
selected for
do.
those really smart students coming in, so
Yeah.
they're performing at a higher
And
level.
if they're all really motivated,
Yeah.
and it can happen. In fact, you kind of hope that it will happen. So, you might find that you are finding a lot of students in your top category, but you can set the grades with the points, when we do group grading, which we do some of with our portfolios, they rate them on a letter scale, but the teacher can then say, okay, but 5 and 6 are an A, or just 6 is an A, or, 4 is a B, and, so you can set that, but you have to be open with your students about what you're doing.
And all A's in a class might be too easy, it also could mean you just did an
Amazing
job.
job.
I like option B.
And the one thing too, like, I just wanna, before we end, really quickly said that, Eileen mentioned group grading. If you have any classes that you teach the same class with another instructor or, a group of people, that can be a really powerful thing to try to come up with a group rubric. Not necessarily one that you all use, but just that process itself can be really powerful. And there is a lot of evidence, just so you know, that if you do come up with a rubric and you train on it a little bit, like you learn to really calibrate yourself to the rubric, that there's a ton of inter-rater reliability with a good rubric. In other words, 2 different people using the same rubric would score the same paper within 1 point of each other. So, like, that's one of the reasons why it's such a tried and true assessment technique. And, as you develop them, if you ever try to do it with somebody else and there isn't a lot of inter-rater reliability, it could be because the rubric is really hard to understand or hard to manifest. Anyway.
I was just gonna say, Steve and I continue to find problems in the 2 intermediate categories.
And you will, they are the hard
Yeah.
part. And either think of it as you start at the bottom and then do value added till you get to A, or you start with A, here's my, Platonic ideal paper, and then what is it missing at each level? So you kind of can think of it that way.
Yep. And
But-
fully expect to revise the rubrics after you do them once, just like with that's the first time you're gonna get any kind of feedback on how it works in the real world. And so just know that you'll probably wanna tweak some stuff. And, as you draft, one thing too that I encourage you to do is put down everything you think should go into an awesome paper in the categories, and then at the end of the day, you may find that you don't actually care as much about some things. So don't give yourself permission to drop things out, or
If none of your
aggregate
students are doing that or whatever.
exactly, or
yeah.
aggregate them, realize that I can put these three things together, so.
It's
all
not
stuff.
perfect,
Yeah.
but think about it's being better and clearer to students than nothing, or a two-line sentence at the end. This at least takes what they were asked to do, lays it out in coherent form, and asks and evaluates them on that. And grading is an imperfect world for a lot of the reasons you suggested, that each student is different, each take on an assignment makes you stop and think. But at least this is tied to things you asked them to do, that you taught them how to do, and that they know going in. And I think all of those factors make the rubrics worth considering. Not solving all your grading problems or anything like that, but an interesting tool for your pedagogical kit, I think,
Absolutely. And also, in addition to inter-rater reliability, if you have a good rubric, there's a lot of evidence for intra-rater reliability. In other words, you will use the rubric to see similar things in papers, and you should have confidence in using them pretty quickly, efficiently, like in terms of some of the goals that some of you set for today's session in terms of trying to be more efficient about your assessment. Even what it looks like. We already talked about that at the beginning. This is more fine-grained, hopefully, so you know what they did, and you don't just have that confusing read-through of the papers. You probably guessed which ones were going to be the 5 awesome ones. Oh, sure enough, they were. And then what do you do with the rest of them? You should, especially after you really tried to do a rubric once and you feel like you revised it and you feel good about it, don't be surprised if it is more efficient. And then give yourself that permission to go through quickly and say, like, yeah, that's what it is. I looked. There is an argument. Revert back to yours that I saw a little bit about thesis statement. There is an argument, but it's not throughout the paper. So that's here. That's a 3.
And after you've done it, you can also say to the students, so was this a helpful method of evaluation for you? Here's how it worked for me. You could tell them some of the questions you had, and then you could decide, do you want to go on with this, or do you want to try something else? It's a good getting to know you assignment at the beginning of a course, because you do unpack a lot of your assumptions, like what does this teacher want? How students are always trying to figure that out. Well, you've kind of told them. And I think that's a good opening gambit on the chessboard of teaching.
Do you have a question, Steve?
I do have a question. The assignment we were talking about, the assignment of mine, is related to a Discover class that I'll have in the fall. And I would very much like, I don't know if this is offered or if this is a possibility, I would very much like to actually discuss some of the things I think you talked about in the previous workshop with someone.
Yeah.
Is there?
Yes, I'm your person. So
really?
I think
Not now, but I mean.
No, exactly. Brenda wanted to, I think, make sure that many of you are already doing it, that there's evaluations of today.
No, what I was gonna actually chime in is that we have a video of that workshop where we saved the kind of the highlights of it on the Teaching Commons, as well as the materials that were used.
Awesome.
So you can get on there and look at that, and then kind of your next point of follow-up would be Matthew, after you've sort of spent a little time looking at that material, then you could bring questions or specific things to him so that he doesn't have to redo the entire workshop per se, but at least could then discuss specific questions with you.
They do a lot of one-on-one consultations with faculty about assignment design, rubric design.
So it's all on the Teaching
That's my job,
Commons,
which
which is
the
Teaching Commons at the top
That
of
would be,
the
I would love to do that.
We have past workshop videos.
One of the other ideas we had, and we may try to do it sometime, Julie Boxer, who's also from Writing Literature Discourse, and I did the last workshop with, she was toying around the idea, what if we had commenting on student writing, grading student writing, and then we have like open sessions where people could bring actual student papers to it. Time is going to be the issue there. Like, do you have a stack of papers that week? But we might be able to run a couple and just see what happens at some point in the future. So you'd actually be able to get feedback on putting it in practice. Okay. Because that's the tough part.
Would you be willing to email us these?
Yeah, we'll put them up on the Teaching Commons.
Yeah, and Hannah Arby, who's my assistant, will send an email out to you. I'll say, thank you for attending, and then she'll let you know where you can access all this material next week.
That's great.
And then
and speaking of which,
if you... the Teaching Commons rubric page as well?
Yes.
In that email, because there's a bunch more on the Teaching Commons.
That's really
Yes. And then to that end, if you did not sign in, make sure that you do on your way out, once that we can give you credit for attending if you are in the certificate program, but then also so we can make sure that we get your name on that email. As long as you're in the University Outlook system, all we need is your name.
Thanks a lot for coming, Mel.
Thank you all for coming, and thanks Matthew and Eileen.